What I liked about what Professor Mamdani said is it's important to ask the right questions. Unless you ask the right question, you will not get a great answer.
Even if you don't descend, or you're not a descendant of that nation, it can still be a homeland.
He was able to straddle. I could pick out from a lot of his work that I've read, he was able to straddle across different concepts of his work.
I want to start right at the beginning with the concept of slow poison. What does it mean? And so that even as we're having the whole conversation, we're trying to think of all the titles. Why slow poison? Why are these two words what you want us to take us through the entire book?
Thank you, Mshai. I hope this is working and well enough. I want to thank Ahmed for making it possible for me to come here and address two large audiences and talk about this book. It makes sense to begin with the title, Why Slow Poison? When the British conquered the piece of territory that they ultimately named Uganda, their primary objective was political, more than economic. The political objective was, how do we retain control of this territory? The people under their control responded. That response was called resistance. And the British were concerned how to tackle this resistance, how to undermine it. They had learned through really centuries, they had learned to appreciate the Roman method, what the Romans called divide and rule. And they began to perfect this method. So divide and rule for the British did not mean. So the British adopted this notion of divide and rule from the Romans. But they made one change. And the change they made was they were not going to divide and rule existing identities. They were going to create new identities. And in creating new identities, they were going to fragment the population they would be ruling. I'll talk about this as we go on. So the task of the anti-colonial movement was how to reverse this process. How do you put together the fragments? What were the fragments? The British claimed that the fragments were authentic Africa. And authentic Africa was tribal Africa. And the nationalist movement claimed that authentic Africa had a diversity of cultures. But that did not mean that it was fragmented in the way the British claimed. The diversity of cultures related to different languages, But the British claimed more than that. They claimed that each culture had a homeland where the people had lived from time immemorial. That each culture had a leadership. Which had been timeless. So the nationalist movement, or the anti-colonial movement, set about disproving this proposition. Uganda, as you know, did not have a very strong and powerful nationalist movement. Ironically, the high point of the nationalist movement, I suggest, was Idi Amin. Idi Amin wanted to create a single African country. And this African country would be a black country. Idi Amin's notion of Africa as a black continent came from his mother, Amaita. His mother belonged to a quasi-religious group which had been in operation for many decades, and which basically wanted the non-African out of Africa. When Amin is followed by Museveni, Museveni is preoccupied with the same question that had preoccupied the British, which is how do you make sure that those you have brought together in a fight for resistance now don't turn around and fight you? And Museveni's response was that the way to make sure of that, it was a repeat of the British response, was to fragment it. And fragmentation for Museveni was not a fragmentation of languages and cultures. It was a political fragmentation. Museveni, when he came into power, there were about 20, 25 districts in Uganda. Museveni created a whole host of districts, more than 100, and then more than 200. And then he introduced the principle that every district would be defined after its indigenous population. And that the population was not indigenous would not have certain basic rights in the district. What basic rights? The right to a government job, and so on. The right to customary land, so Museveni began to fragment the country. Every 5-year term, he carried this process forward. I call it slow poison.
And so we're thinking about how identity is politicized, and the strategy of the state of control or governance is how do we control these people using identity? And I want to ask a question because you said something interesting. If this is about, and in the title it talks about the making of the nation, right? I'm interested in the fact that you use two of Uganda's presidents, Idi Amin and Yoweri Museveni, but not the president we might have thought of as the father of the nation, because we tend to think of our founding presidents, you know, Jomo Kenyatta, Baba wa Taifa, Julius Nyerere, Baba wa Taifa. Yet in this book, you say Idi Amin is the father of the Ugandan nation, and then and I guess Museveni would call himself the grandfather of the Ugandan nation, I don't know. But why not Milton Obote, who was actually in office as Prime Minister and President much longer than Idi Amin.
Well, my claim is that the Ugandan nation was born in 1972 with the Asian expulsion. The Ugandan nation was born as a black nation. Amin's ambition was to create black millionaires, as he said it. Never mind that he soon realized that these black millionaires were seen to be a rebirth of the Asians, seen to be involved in the same practices. This picture you see on the cover, this is a woman trader, 1974-75. She's tried under the Economic Crimes Act for overcharging, for Asian practices, as they used to call them. And that is her. If you look at the expression on her face, she's completely perplexed. What is an Asian practice? Why shouldn't I charge? If the demand is more and the supply is less, etc., etc. If I may diverge a little bit, one of the questions in my mind was, the Asian question was an East Africa-wide question. It wasn't just in Uganda. How come the expulsion was only in Uganda?
Can I come to that? Because I want to bring that together with the other community that's very present. And I don't think I've ever seen a book in all my reading on the Nubi. And you center the Asian and the Nubi communities. We have them here in Nairobi. I don't even think we think much. I don't know. They are a community officially of Kenya now, right? With the Asians are the 44th. The Nubians are the 40 what? Nairobians, Kenyans. We added tribes. I think the Nubians are now a Kenyan tribe, right? The Asians are the 44th tribe, right? The Makonde are the 55th. I'm interested in why you focus not on the, usually our stories are about the big majorities. And you say these two communities are very critical. But I just wanted to say, I love that you talk about the cover, because for me, what that cover does, another edition has the trappings of the military. And I think it then really makes us think about Museveni and Amin as the army, and the power of the army. But this cover takes us to, while all these people are doing all this, and the state is doing all this, the impact is on the ordinary people. And I like that in the background you can see other people, but also that the microphone that is there, literally she's unable to speak. She is so perplexed, and she has no words to explain it. And I think this is a really powerful way of saying the book is about those big figures, but it's also about the people no one looks at. So take me to the Asians and the Nubi and why they're so important to you.
The British designed not just Uganda, but most of their colonies in the 20th century as places which would have two different groups that would checkmate one another. One would be the group of people who lived in the place, who grew crops, who produced the wealth of the land. And the other would be people who would be brought in from outside, migrants. They would be like conveyor belts in the colony. There would be migrant labor. There would be itinerant traders. There would be soldiers. They would be defined as non-indigenous. The locals would be defined as indigenous. And part of the struggle after independence was for non-indigenous groups to claim to be indigenous. I can talk about that because I believe that's a wrong strategy. But, so I begin with two non-indigenous groups, the Asians and the Nubi. The first Asians that come into Uganda are soldiers, not traders. And the Nubi are soldiers with Amin Pasha. The Nubi are being forced to force march, are being compelled to force march. And there are two mutinies. And the British bring in troops from the Indian Punjab, Sikhs and Muslims, to put down Nubi mutinies. In a chapter where I sort of discuss the biography of Idi Amin, I show how the Idi Amin family had contacts with Asians for a long period. I show that Idi Amin grew up as a toddler with a Baluchi child. His mother had a Baluchi friend. And the two of them would go out to do petty trade. One would put the two toddlers, one on each breast, while the other would do the trading, and then they would change places. Idi Amin had an aunt who was married to a Sikh guy, so on and so forth. When the mutinies ended and these soldiers lived together in the barracks, they were neighbors. As Amin grew up, at the age of 5, 6, he was in a madrasa, and he began to work as a kasanvu, which is kind of a forced labor, in the Meta plantation. And there he had his experience of the fellow who would make sure, who would squeeze every ounce of energy out of him. And Idi Amin grew up with a sense that there are good Indians and bad Indians. The good Indians were those who lived with him in the barracks, and the bad Indians were the plantation Indians. So, this encounter would be writ large as they went on. And I thought it made sense to begin with the encounter between these two, but also the encounter between two immigrant communities, non-indigenous communities, who would in many ways shape the future of Uganda.
And indeed then the Nubi and other black African communities in Uganda under Amin become welcomed as you are welcome, you are part of us. But under, and so Amin, that you wanted, we were talking about the expulsion, then the difference between the Nubi and the Asians is that the Asians are non-indigenous, but also they are not black Africans. And so Amin's definition of who becomes a citizen is understood as a citizen differs from, if I understand you correctly, from Museveni, who says, but then now we have to add the question of indigeneity and where you actually belong. Where is your ancestry here in Uganda? Am I with you, or have I lost you? Or have you lost me?
You've lost me. Well, let me tell you why you've lost me. Mm-hmm. I think the language of black African to explain politics is problematic.
I agree, but that is what Amin used.
I think that the anti-colonial movement throughout this continent has wrestled with the question, who are we? Who belongs? Who is an African? In Uganda, we never really thought through it in any great depth. But I think the place where they did think through it in some great depth was South Africa. Yeah. In South Africa, they began by thinking of a South African as a black person, more or less as you say. Black majority rule. That was the demand of the South Africans. And then it changed. There were two changes. One was the Freedom Charter of the ANC in 1953, which said South Africa belongs to all those who live in it. But this charter was never really practiced on the ground. The ANC never admitted Indian members to the ANC until the 1980s. But the real change came with Steve Biko. Steve Biko, in the 1960s, has a remarkable statement. He says, black is not a color. Black is an experience. If you are oppressed, you are black. He completely subverts the meaning of black. And he creates a new political language. And that new language is that in South Africa, all those non-white are black. This is the Biko legacy, right? It's not there anymore. But it's the legacy he leaves behind for us to think through. I think that it's problematic for us to practice a politics whereby we minorities demand to be considered indigenous and be put on the list of indigenous tribes. And that list can grow or it can shrink, but it's meaningful to be an indigenous tribe only because there are others who are not indigenous. Yeah. The South African legacy was that citizenship depends not on descent, not on where you come from, but where you are going. It depends on residence. If you live in a place, then you expect to charter a common future with others who live in that place. And that's citizenship. It's a very different notion of citizenship. And I think we need to think about it.
I agree with you. And I think in neither native nor settler, you really think through a lot of those issues. But in Uganda, and I think you said that this is a conversation that is happening in the 70s in South Africa. In Uganda, however, we're looking at how Amin is thinking about this. And I want to contrast that because earlier on you had said Museveni goes in a completely different direction. And I want to just stay with some of the contrasts between the two for a few minutes because I think we're talking about political strategy. And because political strategy and those who went with black consciousness were saying, let's stop looking at black simply as, in terms of race, simply as ancestry, we're looking at it as an ideology. I want you to just walk me through, if I got you right in terms of Amin's political strategy was to unify a nation. Museveni's was to let's scatter, let's divide, and there are impacts on that. I think what you're doing is saying to us, if you are looking at governing a nation, what is your strategy? What is the way you use how is identity in conversation with all this? So this is why I was saying for Amin, it seems to me Amin is thinking, I can use race as a way of erasing, and this question of it no longer is about who is Uganda because you've got generations who tie you here. It is really about even the people who come from outside can find home as long as their ancestry links them to this continent originally.
You asked me earlier, why not Obote?
Yes.
The first expulsion in Uganda's history of non-indigenous groups was Obote's expulsion of the Luo from Uganda. Obote completely swallowed the colonial story that there are indigenous groups and non-indigenous groups. And the non-indigenous groups do not have rights that indigeneity gives. It's not just Obote, but many African presidents of that first generation
did that, yeah.
The Ghanaians who were thrown out of Nigeria. Ghana must go, right? Many others. So it was so I'm looking for turning points. I'm looking for where this, not just the person who was the first president, so
Yeah.
what?
Yeah.
You know, I'm looking for the person who questioned the legacy. And it's ironic, and we can talk about it, totally ironic that Amin, who came into power personifying that legacy, he was the bitter fruit of the British Army and its terror campaigns in East Africa. How does he turn around? What happens? With your permission, I'll talk about it, but I'll wait.
Actually, I would like you to do that, because what I would like us then to look at is what you do in the book is you both reassess Amin, not sanitize him. I think yesterday you said, let's face it, Amin was cruel. Amin was all these things. And then you do the same with Museveni, because we have said, you know, Museveni is a breath of fresh air after all that Uganda went through in the first 20 years. Museveni comes in as a comrade. I think the phrase that was used, revolutionary violence, is what he believed in. He was somebody who studied Fanon and was like, we are going to decolonize. We are going to turn the wretched of the earth into the owners of the earth. And you look at the two and you say, we need to reassess them. We need to look at them and ask questions about both of them. So start with Amin, and then let's go to Museveni.
Let's start with Amin and go to Museveni. Because these are two opposed journeys. And I need to explain in what sense they are opposed. Amin is recruited by the British as a child soldier. Amin is trained in what the British Army calls counterinsurgency. What we have come to realize is really a polite word for state terrorism. Amin demonstrates to African heads of state in Morocco how he was able to take a handkerchief and support a Mau Mau insurgent, suffocate a Mau Mau insurgent with a handkerchief. He was proud of it. He was cruel. Amin's worst massacres were the years 1971-72, when he came to power. Important thing to remember is that his massacres were under the tutelage of the British and the Israelis. When he came to power, the British advised him that really he ought to kill Obote. And the Israelis said, no, that's not the most important thing. You have to take care of his cohorts. Otherwise, they'll be around the corner when you turn the corner. You will not be able to consolidate your power. And Amin goes from one barrack to another with his soldiers, killing these cohorts in the hundreds. That was his worst period. If you look at the press at that time, the British press in this period is applauding Amin as a great leader who has rid Africa of a great tyrant called Obote. They are applauding Amin because he's saying that Africa must reconcile with South Africa. They're applauding Amin because he's saying that Africa must negotiate with Ian Smith and Rhodesia. All of these things. But then Amin carries out 3 expulsions in 1 year. The expulsion of the Israelis, the Asian expulsion, and the British expulsion. Why? Why does he carry these out? During the expulsion of the Asians, there is an invasion organized by an alliance of Tanzania and the Brits. It doesn't succeed because Nyerere, who is under the impression that the people would rise up against Amin, realizes that nobody is rising up, that actually the people were supporting Amin, that they were catching Museveni's guerrillas and handing them over to the army. There are books written about this. Well, Amin's first travel after coming to power is to Israel. He asks the Israelis for arms. He wants to carry out an operation against Tanzania. And he wants military aircraft. And the Israelis laugh him off. They give him something petty. Then he goes to England and he makes the same demand, and the British also laugh him off. He's humiliated. He sends his education minister, Abu Mayanja, to Egypt to see Sadat and to ask his advice. Sadat says, let Amin come to Egypt and I will introduce him to Gaddafi in Libya. Gaddafi has just supported Nimeri in Sudan to cut short a coup by the Communist Party people. He has brought down a plane, and he says to Amin, well, the only way you can get out of this is to form an alliance with Nimeri. And the only way you can form an alliance with Nimeri is to acknowledge that you were wrong in what you have been doing, which is joining with the Israelis to form a counterinsurgency group in South Sudan, the Anyanya. Now, you have an option, which is to come together with Haile Selassie, the Emperor of Ethiopia, and to calm this civil war and bring them together with those they had been fighting. Amin does that. The Addis Ababa conference, the Anyanya sign a peace agreement. The Israeli advisor to the Anyanya is thrown out by Haile Selassie. The Anyanya army is divided into two. Half of it joins the Sudan army, the other half joins Amin's army. This will resurface later as the problem which leads to the Mtukula war with Tanzania. We can talk about it. So Amin sees, he begins to understand that there is more to it than fighting. There is politics. And politics is about alliance building. And if you look at Amin's record from there, from 1972 to 1978, it's a record of learning politics. Amin does three things. He brings the Kabaka's body back to Uganda. And in welcoming the body, he says we're going to bury not just the Kabaka, but we're also burying the kingdoms. It's the exact opposite of what Museveni will do in 1995. Amin is faced with the problem of what is called disappearances. He is visited by a police team which tells him that the police have lost all raison d'etre, all power, that army have taken over from the police, that army have the power of arrest, that army are loaning out their uniforms to anybody with an interest in revenge or an interest in making money, in realizing their ambitions. Amin puts a commission of inquiry in place, which is 3 people. It's headed by a Pakistani-British judge who is well known in Uganda because he had headed an inquiry under Obote and he had the guts to go against the government. Amin appoints this commission of inquiry. The commission identifies the military units which have been involved in these disappearances. The commission recommends reforms and changes, and the chair of the commission leaves the day after he hands over the report, which is a 800-plus page report. Third thing Amin does was to create land reform. I won't go into detail. It's all there in the book. But the point I'm making is that Amin gradually learns the art of politics and not see politics as just another form of warfare. This is when the American ambassador to Kenya, and I quote him, talks about how surprised he is as to how quickly Amin is learning the art of statecraft. And Museveni.
I just want to say, I think one of the lines you've made me really think about Amin is when you said Amin was a master of theater, that once he understood this is the image they have created of me, he took it, he amplified it, he played with it, and he really then you begin to ask who is manipulating who, and as he puts his agenda forth. But let's come to Museveni.
Amin, you're right. Amin is a master of theater. Amin realized that he was the object of racist caricature, that he had been caricatured in the Western world as an African who had the mentality of a child and the cruelty of an adult. And he would always turn it around when he would be asked a question. If he was asked, they say, you ate him. Charges of cannibalism. Amin would say, I ate him before he could eat me. So what does that mean? Right? If Amin was told, there's no freedom of speech in Uganda, his answer would be, we have freedom of speech. We don't have freedom after speech. He was saying, show me a country in the world where there's freedom after speech. He wrote to Nixon, wishing him a speedy recovery after Watergate. He wrote to the Queen, sent a birthday card to Mr. and Mrs. Queen. I mean, it was all tongue-in-cheek, but it was not useless. So Museveni is a different story. Museveni, unlike Amin, does not begin as a child soldier. He begins as a trained guerrilla in Frelimo, the Mozambican army. He writes his senior thesis on armed struggle in praise of Frantz Fanon. When he comes to power in Uganda, his romance with violence continues. My deep sense was that that violence was no longer revolutionary violence. That was the violence that he practiced in order to keep the power that he had won. It was no different from the violence that he fought when he thought he was practicing revolutionary violence. He had turned into his opposite. This is one of the questions that intrigued me. But you see, the thing is, the answer to that question to me was, Amin and Museveni faced similar dilemmas. Amin realized that he didn't have the resources to carry out the program he wanted to carry out, which was a kind of decolonization program, and we can discuss that later. But he didn't have the resources. He had an option: either capitulate or fight to the bitter end. Amin fought to the bitter end. Museveni faced the same dilemma when he came to power in 1979. In 1986. He came to power in 1986. His treasury was empty. Every speech he gave, he would talk about how he didn't have enough cadres. He sent teams to different countries in the world asking for material help, and they all said to him, you better make up with the IMF first. Sign the Washington Consensus. And Museveni capitulated. It was exactly the opposite of Idi Amin. Not only did he capitulate, but over time, instead of seeing this as a tactical retreat from which he would recover once he had resources, he began to dress up necessity as virtue. He began to speak about how, like Saul on the road to Damascus, he had seen the light. So, these are two opposite stories. So they're not just stories about two leaders. They are stories about two attempts at decolonization. And I had been reading about decolonization, but the theory of decolonization. Read Nkrumah about how decolonization had to be political. I read the Kenyan theorists who, not yet Uhuru. I read Ngugi wa Thiong'o, mental decolonization. I read Frantz Fanon, decolonization as a complete act of renewal. So these were all about, they were, I'm going to be harsh, but in some ways they were pious. They were sermons. I wasn't interested in a sermon. See, I studied political theory in Western universities. And when I studied political theory, they taught us that political theory is about what is the good life. So you studied the pagans before the Christians, which were the Greeks and the Romans, and you understood from them what is the good life. But then I came to Dar es Salaam, although we never theorized it. But as I reflected on it later on, I realized that in Dar es Salaam, political theory was not about figuring out what is the good life. Political theory was about asking two questions. How did we get here? And how do we get out of here? These were the questions both Amin and Museveni asked. How did we get here? What do we do about it? And those are the questions we are faced with. I don't think that reading, don't get me wrong, I am not asking you not to read, but I am asking you to read with a certain degree of skepticism. Don't read about somebody's dreams. That's not try and understand our own position, how we got into it, how others have gotten into it. And I always thought that political theory had to be, focused on time and place. It couldn't just be universal, global. An answer to it being an answer to every part of the world. No.
So I was looking through my notes. There are several people who came to mind as I was reading it, and almost your entire body of work. I could go through and start saying this book, this book, this book. It's almost like you go back and think through certain ideas and revise them. So anybody who is studying Mamdani, and I know a couple of people here are using him, students, yay! This is a good book to give you all of that, to make you go back to certain texts. But one quote that came to me, this is Aminata Fona in the window seat. And she says, nation building is no simple task. Democracy takes more than a parliament building. The generation of Africans to whom the task fell of creating new countries knew or came to know that alongside the desire and dreams and the promise of newfound freedoms, they had been set up to fail. The real courage lay in the fact that they did not surrender, that they tried to do what they promised themselves and their countries they would. They went forward anyway. And I'm not validating their choices. I'm not saying they made good choices. But reading Museveni through this book, I realized that Museveni got so caught up with staying as president, because before him, I don't know, there had been 6 presidents. And I think he was just like, how can I hang on? That he lost sight of why he came into power. That was my impression. But I do want to do one thing before I know Abigail is getting ready to come. I want to turn attention to the other figure in this book, and that is Mahmood Mandani. And not just Mahmood Mandani. So several things that happened as you were speaking, I just thought of, wow, you know, when we are thinking about our countries, we think of ourselves and the people in our country. And just in that bit where you were talking about Amin, you talked about Nyerere, Sadat, Gaddafi, Numeri, Selassie. I'm realizing, wow, it's not just one country. Then you talked about the British and the Israelis. There's this bigger global context. But then you also take us into the country and onto the ground. And the part where you talk about yourself and several other intellectuals, this is in part 2 where you're talking about the transition. What happened between Amin's departure and Museveni's arrival? And 2 things that came to me. Number 1, people were focusing on just get rid of Amin. There was no unity in terms of once Amin goes, then what? The second thing for me is you look at, and I think it's a call to say where I am, who I am, whatever my profession is, how am I preparing myself in this liminal space for the next chapter? And being an intellectual, you really take us into the spaces of the study groups. Yesterday, our last question was something on the line of where are those study groups? And you said right here. So you take us into the right here of that moment. And you're telling us of these intellectuals, and I'm like, wow, that one went and led a revolutionary violence, DRC. That one went to Rwanda. This one became this in Uganda later on. So take me into that space. What does it mean to be an intellectual in Africa, especially in a society in flux, in transition, in transit to being a nation? What did it mean then when you were in this period, in the 70s, in the 80s, those early years? And what does it mean now? Has it changed? Is it the same thing? Can we still have those study groups that out of which we will get CJs, directors of CBK, presidents, heads of armies, all these interesting people?
Well, I think the first big mistake we made and continue to make is to swallow the Western project as our own project. And that's the project to create a nation. Nkrumah's Secretary General of the CPP, Convention People's Party, once wrote that really it was just convenient to describe ourselves as nationalists. Not all of us were nationalists. We were anti-colonialists. But nation building and nation making was not necessarily our common project. But we never gave time to discussing what after colonialism. We assumed that the answer lay in what Europe had done. And that led to disaster after disaster. I remember when I was in Dar es Salaam, we had just assumed that now that Africa was independent, there would be just a revolution after revolution. And then came the Rwanda genocide. We were knocked out. How do we understand this genocide? I wrote a book about it. And I understood the genocide as the bitter outcome of a nation-building project. The attempt to create a Hutu nation and to deal with the Tutsi minority as a stubborn obstacle in the making of a nation. I began to see this in case study after case study. So I think that most of Africa's internal wars are wars against minorities. So we need to draw some lessons from this.
Mm-hmm. If we were to form ourselves into those study groups and we're thinking about this, I'm going to ask you a really big question, and it will be, what might we as Africans, let me put it this way, you talk about the making of the nation state. I want to see ourselves as global. We are human, we are global. You talk about how we are all over the world. We are migrants, just like everybody else is. We go to places, we make home. But that as a continent, we also have the future of the world. And the world right now is in a polycrisis. No one knows what is going on. What is something we might do as Africans to make the future of the world, from our standpoint, our concerns, our priorities? How can we become a force for good in the world? Because you're saying the Western project, we bought into the Western project. We were on our way, we were following towards the end of history, then we've come to the end of history. Everybody's asking questions. Based on what you have thought through, can we be part of that? Can we be the ones who make the future of the world beyond the nation state as has been given to us through the colonial project?
Well, what would it mean to charter our own path? It would mean, first of all, seeing through the language of indigeneity, seeing that it is nothing but the old colonial language, which is been dressed up as some kind of necessity. Understanding that migration, as you say, is a part of life, it's a fact of life. And that migrants of yesterday become residents of today. And as they become residents of today, they become citizens of tomorrow. We need to think through this, what it means, rather than having look at it, just about every African country has a constitution which makes which divides between two kinds of residents in the country. Those who were there before colonialism and those who are there during and after colonialism. And those who are there during and after colonialism are referred to as non-indigenous. The indigenous definition of indigenous is those who were there before colonialism. It's as if history stopped with colonialism. I'm currently writing a book called Homelands. And the premise of that book is that the very notion of a homeland is problematic. I begin with what is called the Holy Land. And I say that the Bible tells us that Moses led the Jews out of Egypt into Israel. So which is the Jewish homeland, Egypt or Israel?
Don't give them any ideas.
What? And what about those who were in the land of Israel before the Jews got there? What about them? They were massacred. They were thrown out. So I'm not talking of the contemporary Palestinians. I'm talking of then So this fiction of homeland has been a powerful driving force. And to see through that fiction will require an even more powerful imagination. So what does it mean for us? You see, the irony is that if you look at attempts to forge an alternative imagination, you will find that most of these attempts were in settler colonies. They were not outside of settler colonies. So Steve Biko is a product of settler colonialism. Right? The Americans, who after the Civil War, Lincoln came with the notion that citizenship is about residence. So the amendments to the Constitution after the Civil War meant that somebody born in Alabama who moves to California has the same rights as somebody born in California. And similarly with every other state in the Union. So this shift from descent to residence, a very powerful shift, which I think takes place post-American Civil War. We have to give the devil his due. Because Lincoln is the same president who does this, and he's the same president who puts American Indians in reservations throughout the US. Even today, Zionist groups keep on saying this is what Mamdani says, that Lincoln put the American Indians into reservations. How can he say that and be teaching at Columbia?
So I have so many questions, and I really would have loved to talk about the style, and I love the way you've woven the book, but I do want to make sure the audience gets to ask some questions. You guys have some questions? Yeah, so I'm going to come to you. I want to ask one last question as I ask the people with the mics to start getting ready to go into the room. And I want to ask this because I think of all your books. This feels not just personal in the sense that you tell so much of your own story. I know you've done that, especially in From Citizen to Refugee. But it feels personal in the sense that I feel I'm seeing the whole human being. I'm not just seeing your mind, I'm seeing your heart. I'm seeing you grappling with what does it mean. How do I feel about this? It's very subjective. I love it. I'm a performance scholar, and I'm like, finally, the academy, if Professor Mandani is saying the heart matters, this is wonderful. I want to ask you, if you would allow me, you've just talked about homelands, and it occurs to me that you've written about so many countries, so many spaces. You've neither native nor settler, you take us through the whole world. In many of the other books, you've looked at South Africa, Sudan, you've gone to all these places. You keep coming back to Uganda. In a way, I would say it seems you're obsessed with Uganda. This country that you weren't born in, this country that said to you and your family, you're no longer welcome. And when you did come back, it was come back to invest. They said, okay, if we sent you away, sorry but not sorry, come back and invest. You have lived in, I would say, more out of Uganda than in Uganda. But it seems to me, despite saying that the notion of a homeland is something that we really do need to think about, Uganda has your heart, and you continue to grapple with what that means. Can you take us into, yes, I hear you when you say I shouldn't be tied, but can you take us into what that means? Why if we offered you, and I think in one case, Tanzania has offered you citizenship, the British were saying you're crazy to give up your UK citizenship because that passport is stronger. What is this hold that Uganda has over you? And can we offer you Kenyan citizenship while we're about it?
Well, look, I don't have one homeland. I have several homelands. At different points in my life, it has been a different homeland. After Uganda, Tanzania is very close to my heart. I mean, my parents were born in Tanzania. My grandparents were born there. Also in Kenya, in Lamu, and in Zanzibar. But I haven't really counted, but I may have stayed longer in the US than in Uganda. May have, maybe not, because there were 12 years when I was 8 months in Uganda, 4 months in the US. Anyway, but the point is, I never felt US at home until Zoran was elected mayor.
Then it became one of the homes. Yeah.
When he was elected mayor,
You had to know.
I said to Mira, this is home.
Yeah.
I said, yeah.
And this is your only son, so it's yeah.
So when I started writing the book, Mira and Zoran sat me down one day and said, look, Baba, you're not going to write your same old book, which we can't read beyond page 50. You're not going to pretend you were not there. You're going to accept that you were there and take responsibility for it. And frankly, I wasn't totally convinced, but I began to rewrite certain sections. And as I did, I realized that they opened me up to profound dilemmas to which I had no answer. Right? And I had to admit that I had no answer. So it's a new way of writing. It's a way of writing which accepts that you're part of the story you're telling, you're part of the problem you're trying to understand. So on and so forth.
There's a beautiful line you have that I think I will always keep with me, and I've been applying it to different situations here, when you say, we are complicit in our own dilemma. And you use the personal we and not they are. And I think that's the struggle of, I'm seeing the problem, I'm criticizing these politicians drive me up the wall, but this is part of the world that I'm in, and I have to be part of this. And I want to thank you for just being so generous with sharing yourself, even as you're sharing your ideas and asking us to think about these big questions.